good morning, good morning, good morning. It's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you live from my home office in Willow Springs, North Carolina. Uh, it's Monday, June 6th, and we are now in the second week of our 8-week class. Looks like we've got a couple of people in the audience. If you're there, go ahead and check in and say hello in the chat bar. Thank you for coming to the live broadcast. You know, I always love to have people come into the live broadcast. Sort of makes it more interesting and fun for me, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Did anybody do anything fun for the weekend? I had to do some chores, but I did spend some time outside in the sun having a little bit of an adventure. I went to the gym. Not a bad weekend for me. How was your weekend? Did you do anything interesting? If you're out there, go ahead and check into the chat bar and let me know what's up. Today is chapter 2. We're going to be talking about biopsychology. Remember, that's one of the subfields of psychology. There are people who are trained as biopsychologists, and these people are experts in how the structure and chemistry of the brain affects our ability to think, feel, and behave. Looks like we've got Anya Brooks in the audience and my good friend Gustavo from the Dominican Republic. Thanks, Gustavo. I'm glad to see you are here. Gustavo went to the pool during the weekend. Nice. This would be a good pool weekend, right? A great weekend to get out there, get some sun, check out the people, and cool yourself off, right? Good deal. Anybody else do anything fun? Looks like we've got 5 people in the audience. Wow, we're starting to build a crowd. Thank you very much. For those of you who just showed up, I do want to thank you for coming to the lectures. It always makes it more interesting for me. Week 1 is over, so I took the week 1 folder and moved it all the way to the bottom of the lessons tab. If for some reason you want to go back and look at the week 1 stuff, all you do is just scroll down to the bottom of the lessons tab. I always like to keep your current lesson up at the top of the folder so that you can easily access what you need. Anya went shopping this weekend. Sweet. Did you get anything? Tell me what you bought, if it was cool or what. I'd be interested in hearing that. Let's see. Hello, Salim. Good to see you. Thanks for coming today. Oh, look at that. Adrian is also a Dominican. Sweet. You know what? As a lifelong baseball player and baseball lover, the Dominican Republic holds a very important place in my heart. So I'm always glad to have those Dominicans in class. Okay, enough time goofing off. It looks like we've got a pretty good class, including Louis Tapia. Now that Louis is here, we can finally start. Okay, today we're going to talk about the first half of chapter 2. We're going to start building the story by talking about neurons and neurotransmitters. So we're going to have a general introduction of the nervous system. We're going to talk about the anatomy and physiology of the neuron, what neurotransmitters do, how psychoactive drugs work, and then we're going to talk about hormones and how they work sort of like neurotransmitters, okay? Now, let's talk briefly, sort of get an overview of the nervous system. Your nervous system is the part of your body that is responsible for transmitting information into the organism and allowing the organism to respond to the environment in an adaptive way. Now, there are over almost 100 billion neurons in your body, so let's talk a little bit about how we're going to organize the neuron for our discussion today. Okay, you can look at the picture over here on the left, and you see we have a human being, and all of their nerves and nervous system is kind of visible for you. Now, you'll notice that we have a brain and a spinal cord. They're in pink and red, and then you have all these other nerves that go out from the spine and nervous system. What we're going to do is we're going to break the nervous system into 2 parts. We're going to talk about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal column. Well, why do we call it the central nervous system? Because these are the control centers of your body. So your brain controls your muscles, your organs, and your higher mental processes, like what you're engaging in right now as you listen to my lecture. So your brain controls your muscles, your movement, your voluntary movement. It keeps your heart beating and your stomach working. And it also allows you to think intelligently and respond to your environment. Now, the spinal column, people typically don't think about this. It is also a control center, but it controls more simple behaviors. It controls your reflex responses. If you've ever been to the doctor and they take that little rubber hammer and hit you on the knee and your knee kicks out, that's a reflex. A reflex is controlled by your spinal column because they are very, very simple, and they're just stereotypic responses to environmental stimulation, okay? And so these two parts of your nervous system work together to control your body and your functions. Now, let's contrast that with the peripheral nervous system that you see outlined in the blue over here on the side of your screen. These are the neurons that connect your central nervous system to the rest of your body. So there are nerves that go from your brain and spinal column to your heart. There are nerves that go from your brain and spinal column to your stomach. There are nerves that go from your brain and spinal column to your fingers, to your elbows, to your knees. All of these nerves that go from the central nervous system to the periphery of your body are called your peripheral nervous system. Now, we're going to further divide these two sets of nerves into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Somatic means body. That's a good clue for you. So the somatic nervous system is the nerves that go from your brain and spinal column to the muscles in your body. They allow you to feel things that touch you, and they allow your muscles to move around and walk and fight and jump and swim if you're like Gustavo and go to the pool. Now, there are another set of nerves that go from your brain and your spinal column to your internal organs. Now, you typically don't think about having your heart beat, right? That's something that happens automatically without you thinking about it. You don't think about making your stomach work, but it does. And so all of these nerves in the autonomic nervous system go from your brain and spinal column to your internal organs. We're going to call this autonomic. Autonomic, see, that's almost like automatic. So you have a somatic peripheral nervous system that goes to your soma, your body, so that you can control your body. And your autonomic nervous system works automatically, running your internal organs. Hope that makes sense. And that's just a basic overview of how we're going to organize the study of the nervous system. And for the most part, we're going to focus in this class on the brain and how it affects behavior. If you were to go to a four-year college and take a neuroscience class, they'll get into much more detail about all the nerves in and around your body. Okay? Wow, we've got 10 people in the audience, and I want to thank Heaven Lee Kirby for joining us this morning, talking a little bit about the nervous system. Okay, now, the nervous system, all of the nervous system, central nervous system, spinal column, and all these peripheral nerves are composed of two kinds of specialized communicating cells, your neurons and these cells called glial cells. You've probably heard of neurons before, but you may not have heard of glial cells. These are the individual cells that make up this nervous system that you have. Neurons, let's start with neurons. They say you have about 85 to 100 billion neurons in your nervous system. I'm going to be quite honest with you. That sounds kind of made up and guessed. I know nobody went through your nervous system and counted it. Let's just say that there are a ton of neurons in your nervous system. These neurons are what we call one-way communication cells, okay? They communicate one way. These cells are present in birth and come in all shapes and sizes, and their primary function is communication. All shapes and sizes. Did you know you have these teeny tiny neurons in your brain that are microscopic in size? And on the other hand, you have neurons that are 3 feet long, so they come in all shapes and sizes. And if you look below me, you'll see the sensory neuron, the motor neuron, and a pyramidal neuron that you're going to see in your cerebellum. See how they are different shape? They have some basic similarities, but they do look completely different, and they may have different sizes. Their primary function is to communicate. These cells generate little pulses of activity we're going to call action potentials. They do that if they're stimulated by certain chemicals we're going to talk about called neurotransmitters. So they generate electrical activity if stimulated by neurotransmitters, and they also secrete chemicals, these neurotransmitters, to stimulate other neurons to generate electrical activity. I'll explain this in more detail, but just know that they secrete chemicals and they also generate electrical pulses called action potentials. That's what neurons do. Now, you have 10 times as many glial cells as you have neurons, and your glial cells are there to support the function of your neurons. 10 times as many glial cells as neurons. Most of your glial cells are going to develop after you're born. And this is why infants are so helpless and can't walk and can't talk and can't eat and can't do anything. They don't have these glial cells. And as these glial cells grow around the neurons in your nervous system, it's a process called myelination. Your baby begins to take control of their body. So the glial cells are very, very important. They come after birth and they accumulate in the nervous system. And you know what? You're still developing glial cells in your nervous system until your mid-20s. What do glial cells do? Well, the first thing they do is they clean up intracellular waste. As I suggested to you, your neurons are secreting chemicals all around your brain. Well, after these chemicals do their job, glial cells clean them up. They're sort of like the janitors in your nervous system. They clean up these glial cells. They also clean up proteins and other stuff that's floating around that might get in the way of your neuron functioning. So they are janitors, if you will. And some of these glial cells actually grow around the outside of parts of your neurons, and they serve as insulating wires, insulation that allows your neurons to work more efficiently. Remember, neurons are generating electricity, and just like the wires on your technology, your computers, the power cord for your computer, you know how it has a rubber coating on the outside of the electrical wire? Some of these glial cells grow into coating, sheaths of coating that go on the outside of your neurons and help them propagate that electricity more effectively. Does that make sense? I hope I haven't lost you. Somebody go ahead and type in the chat bar and say, makes sense to me, or go, I'm lost. Remember, this lecture, although I'm doing most of the talking, this lecture is interactive, and I'm always happy to have you ask questions if you don't understand something that I'm talking about, okay? So we've got about 80 to 100 million neurons that secrete chemicals and generate electricity, and then you have 10 times as many glial cells that act as support structures, insulating these electrical producing neurons and cleaning up waste that is generated as they perform. Now, you may not have heard of glial cells, but I bet you've heard of demyelination disorders. Have you ever heard of multiple sclerosis? Have you ever heard of amyotrophic sclerosis, sometimes known as Lou Gehrig's disease? There are actually many different types of demyelination disorders. And what happens in these disorders is the glial cells that coat the outsides of these neurons begin to disintegrate for one reason or another. Sometimes your immune system attacks them, other things happen. And what happens in multiple sclerosis and Lou Gehrig's disease is these coatings start decaying around your neurons, and it causes problems in your neurological functioning, okay? We're not going to talk about these disorders, but if you are interested in them, take a neuroscience class, and I guarantee you they will cover these disorders, their progression, and how they affect the nervous system functioning in greater detail. Okay? Now, you folks have you may or may not talk about neurons, but I know you've talked about nerves. Nerves. Now, here's the deal. A nerve is not one neuron. A nerve is actually a bundle of neurons. If you look at this picture over here on the side, what you're going to see is a nerve. Notice how it has a bundle of wires in it. It actually looks like a rope with lots of threads. Those little blue things are neurons. If you'll see all those little blue things, and they're packed together and they're running long ways and sort of a crosscut, those blue things are neurons. And do you see the yellow around each of those blue things? That's the myelin tissue that's composed of glial cells. So you'll notice that a nerve is just a bunch of myelinated axons. Look at that. So it's called a nerve. So do not confuse nerves and neurons. Now, here's the deal. I do want to introduce you to one other term that I know you might not have heard. It's called a tract. Now, a tract is the same thing as a nerve. It's a bundle of neurons. The only difference is a nerve is the word we use to describe a bundle of neurons in your peripheral nervous system. But in your brain specifically, we refer to them not as nerves, but as tracts, if you will. Okay? Now, let's talk further about these nerves. Now, if you think about it, your finger right here has nerves that send information to your brain. I can feel my finger, okay? On the other hand, my brain can tell my finger to move, right? Now, I told you that neurons are one-way communicators. So in order to control my neuron, my finger, I need a neuron coming from my finger to my brain, telling it what the finger is feeling. And then I need a neuron that goes from my brain to my finger that tells my finger to move. We're going to differentiate between what we call motor nerves or motor neurons and sensory nerves or sensory neurons. A motor neuron is a neuron that travels from your brain to activate parts of your body. So I have a motor neuron which moves my arm. On the other hand, I have sensory neurons that tell me when my muscles are aching from lifting too many weights. All right? Does that make sense? Motor neurons go out, sensory neurons come in. And then we're going to get to this in chapter 5. You actually have a third set of neurons. Don't worry about that for this first exam. And these are the neurons that are actually at the periphery of your body, and they feel the environmental stimulation, right? So when you put your hand into a pot of hot water, there are actually neurons that register that heat and send that information to sensory neurons that then transmit it all the way to your brain. Okay, so we have these two basic kinds of neurons in our peripheral nervous system: motor neurons going from the brain out and sensory neurons coming from the brain in. Hope that makes sense. Now, in the CNS, we often refer to these bundles of neurons connecting the two areas of the brain as tracts. This is not going to be on the exam. You don't have to know all of these different tracts in the brain, but I just want to give you an idea. One of the major keys in the nervous system is the connection of areas. The brain is all about connections. And you'll notice that you have these tracts, these pathways that connect the different parts of your brain. Notice them right here in the picture over to the side. One tract we are going to talk about when we get to sensation and perception, when we're talking about vision. You have a bundle of neurons that connect your eye, your retina, the back of your eyeball, to your hypothalamus. You have a tract that goes from your eyeball to your hypothalamus. And what this tract does is it allows your brain to know what time of day it is based upon the sunlight that you see outside. This tract, called the retinohypothalamic tract, is the bundle of neurons that keeps you tied to the sun. You notice how all humans are up during the day and sleep at night? Well, that is controlled by the retinohypothalamic tract, which allows your brain to know whether or not the sun is out. And you have lots of different tracts in your central nervous system. Now, if you look down below me at this picture right here, this is a cool brain imaging technology called a diffuser tension imaging. And what it does is it actually can measure myelin. Myelin is fatty tissue. And what it can do is it can tell you sort of the idea of how the brain's connections work. And you'll notice that you're looking at a person's brain. This is a front view. This person is staring right at you. And you'll notice that they have blue lines going top to bottom. That's connecting your brain to the rest of your body. If you'll notice, we have a couple of red lines going sideways. They connect the left side of your brain to the right side of your brain. And although you really can't see it on this picture, you have tracts that connect the back of your brain to the front of your brain. So these tracts that I'm describing actually go three ways in your brain. They go to your brain, to the peripheral part of your body. They go from the left half of your brain to the right half of your brain, and they go from the back of your brain to the front of your brain. And these tracts are just bundles of neurons. Okay, now here's the deal. Just like we don't call them neurons, we don't call them nerves in the brain, we don't use the word motor or sensory neurons in the brain. We typically talk about afferents and efferents. Okay, afferent brings information to a brain area. So each part of your brain is receiving input from other parts of the brain. The neurons that come into a brain part, we typically refer to them as an afferent. And each part of the brain sends instruction to other parts of the brain. And it does that through neurons. And we'll call these neurons that carry information away from a brain, we'll call them efferents. Okay? So each part of your brain has afferents bringing information into it. And each part of your brain has efferents sending information to another part of your brain. Have I lost anybody yet? Go ahead and type in the chat bar and tell me I'm lost or I've got this, Chris. Hopefully it makes sense to you. Okay, this is just a general organization of the nervous system. Now, let's talk specifically about a neuron. You see below me, there is a picture of a neuron. Uh-oh, you know what? I'm going to disappear for a second. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I forgot. When I turn off my camera, my sound goes off. I apologize. I apologize. I forgot when I turn my camera off, it goes blank. So I'll just talk like this. Excuse me. All right. So here's the deal. This is a neuron right here. You see below me. This is actually two neurons. One neuron connecting with another neuron. You'll notice that, as I suggested to you, neurons are one-way communicators. And so these neurons are communicating left to right, as you see. You'll notice the information, you'll see that there's a cell body on the left side. It's that big yellow structure with the branch-like structures. And it has a root shooting out towards the cell body of another neuron. Okay, now not all neurons look like this. This is the prototypical neuron that we use in Psych 150 to teach students what a neuron looks like and does. All right, so this neuron is communicating from the left side to the right side. Now, if you look over on the left side where the cell body and dendrites are, this is the part of the neuron that is sensitive to chemical stimulation. This part of the neuron is searching for chemical stimulation. And when chemicals are released by another neuron, they stimulate this thing called the cell body. And if this cell body gets enough of the correct stimulation, it's going to generate a pulse of electricity called an action potential that is going to run from this cell body all the way down the length of this axon, all the way to these things called terminal buttons that are then going to release their own chemicals. Okay? So your neuron on the left side of the neuron, the dendrites are sensitive to chemicals called neurotransmitters. And on the other side of the neuron where the terminal buttons are, you have collections of chemicals that can then stimulate other neurons. Okay? Hopefully everybody can hear me now. All right? So what I'm going to want you to know on this test are the four parts, let's call it the 5 parts of the neuron. The myelin sheath goes around the outside of the neuron, but we'll call it part of the neuron. And we want you to know what each of these parts of the nervous system of the neuron does. So let's start from the end. The dendrites. These dendrites are branch-like structures that extend from the cell body. There's hundreds or thousands of receptor sites on these little dendrites, little protein locks, if you will. These dendrites have thousands of little protein locks that unlock when they're stimulated by the proper chemical molecule. These dendritic bumps, these little bumps, are sensitive to stimulation from neurotransmitter molecules and actually drug molecules as well. Okay, and their job is to sample the chemicals that are being secreted by other neurons. Okay, now they grow out from this thing called the cell body. Now the cell body does what any other nucleus of a cell does. It has the little ribosomes and the DNA and the organelles and all of that structure that you learned about in biology class. Your cell body contains the nucleus of the cell. On the other hand, it also, in a sense, is sensitive to this to the chemical stimulation that is being provided by the dendrites. So in a sense, it's waiting, and it's waiting on messages from your dendrites. If it gets enough stimulation from excitatory neurotransmitters, it becomes depolarized and causes a pulse of electricity to be created. Okay, and we're going to talk about excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters in just a minute. Don't get hung up on that. But basically what I want you to know is if it gets stimulated enough by the right chemicals, it generates a pulse of electricity, which it then sends down this root-like structure called the axon. And so basically this cell body can send a pulse of electricity to somewhere else in the brain. Okay, that's what the cell body does. Now, this pulse of electricity travels down the axon. The axon is a long root-like projection from the cell body, and it provides a connection to the neuron. This is the part of the neuron that makes a neuron teeny tiny or small. Some axons are microscopically short. There are actually other axons in your spinal column, your motor neurons, that can actually be 3 foot long. So a part of your brain can send an electrical pulse to a place almost 3 feet away. Okay? And that pulse of electricity travels down the length of the axon. And so second by second, your cell body is being inundated with chemical messages. And it sends one electrical impulse, or it might send a bunch of them in a row. And each snap represents an electrical impulse. So a neuron at rest is sending an action potential maybe every couple seconds. But if it gets stimulated by the proper chemical, it gets excited and will send a bunch of action potentials down the length of this axon. All right. Now, what happens is when this electrical axon gets all the way down to the end, when this electrical impulse gets all the way down to the end of the axon, it runs into this end of the axon is called the terminal buttons. And in these terminal buttons, you have little collections of these neurotransmitter chemicals. And they're inside your terminal button, but when the electricity gets all the way to the terminal button, it causes the membranes of the terminal button to open, and these chemicals seep out of your terminal button, and they float over to the next neuron, to the dendrites of the next neuron. So this is how your brain communicates electrochemically. The cell body on one side is sampling the chemicals around it, and if it gets enough of the right kind of chemicals, it's going to generate a pulse of electricity that will travel to a different part of the brain and make chemicals be released in a different part of the brain. So we say that neurons work electrochemically. Now there's one part of this picture that I didn't talk about. It's the myelin sheath. If you'll notice, what you see are a bunch of hot dog, like a string of sausages or hot dogs on the outside of the axon. These things are called, this is called myelin sheath. And basically, it's hundreds and thousands of little glial cells that have wrapped themselves, that grow and wrap themselves around your axon, just like an insulating wire. This fatty coating doesn't grow on all axons, just the axons of larger neurons. What they do is they insulate the neuron and they actually speed up the electrical pulse, the action potential that travels down your neuron. They actually make your neurons communicate even faster. Okay, so what do I want you to know for this class? I want you to know the functions of these 5 different parts of the neuron. I'm actually not going to have a picture of the neuron on this semester's exam, but I do want you to know what a dendrite does, what a cell body does, what an axon does, and what kinds of things are inside of a terminal button. Now, you'll see this down here at the bottom of the picture. I have a word. If you'll look all the way down where the terminal buttons of the first neuron connect to the dendrites of the second neuron, you see this word that starts with an S down here called a synapse. Let's talk briefly about this thing called a synapse. Now, here's a crazy thing that you won't believe. Even though you have 100 billion neurons in your nervous system that are packed really, really close together, they do not actually touch one another. No 2 neurons actually touch one another. Instead, there's a small gap between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. There's a teeny tiny small place that's perfect for dumping chemicals. This space between 2 neurons is called a synapse, a synaptic gap, if you will. Okay? And what this does is this prevents the electricity from one neuron continuing to the next neuron. So the electrical charge stops at the end of the neuron at the terminal button. But what this electrical impulse does is it causes the terminal button to release its chemicals into this small gap. And you see over here a picture, and these little red things that are in the gap are called neurotransmitters. And if you see the blue things, they are the protein receptor sites that I mentioned about 10 minutes ago. And they are like locks. And these little neurotransmitters are shaped perfectly to work on certain receptor sites, just like keys work in some locks. Okay? So what happens is after this action potential gets to the end of the terminal button, it causes these little chemical keys to seep out of the terminal button and into the synapse, where they float across the synapse and they open the locks, these receptor sites. Okay? Now, here's the thing. There are 2 kinds of neurotransmitters. Some of these neurotransmitters make the neuron more likely to generate an action potential. Some neurotransmitters are what we call excitatory. They make the next brain part more active. On the other hand, some neurotransmitters make the next neuron less likely to generate an action potential. They inhibit the activity of the next neuron, and they're called inhibitory neurotransmitters. Okay, so chemicals work in 2 ways. They cause the next neuron to get excited and generate electricity. They're excitatory. Or they cause the neuron to become less likely to generate electricity. They are inhibitory. Now, most neurotransmitters are not completely excitatory or completely inhibitory. Really, it depends on where they are secreted. So the final effect of a neurotransmitter often depends upon where it is released in the nervous system. Okay, now, quickly, neurotransmitters send their message and then they're cleaned up, just like I suggested to you early. They're cleaned up through basically one of 2 processes. There's a process called reuptake. So as soon as these neurochemical molecules connect and send their message and come back into the synapse, the terminal button sucks them back into its structure so it can use them again. On the other hand, some of these chemicals that are floating around are actually eaten up or collected. Some of them are degraded by enzymes, and as I suggested to you, some of them are swept up by these glial cells. And the glial cells work in these synapses to clean the waste up because you want a free pathway so that these molecules can go from one neuron to the next neuron. Does this make sense so far? Do we understand the idea of chemicals? And what this does, this allows one part of the brain that gets excited to send an electric potential causing the release of chemicals in another part of your brain. And these chemicals are what cause different parts of your brain to become active. As you are focusing on me right now, acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, is being released right here in the front part of your brain. And it's causing this part of your brain, which is where your focus and thinking is, to become more active. So as you're paying attention to me, this chemical called acetylcholine is causing the frontal lobe of your brain to become active so you can pay attention to my lecture. Okay? So I do want you to know, actually, I guess it's 6 structures. The 5 structures of a neuron, and I want you to know what a synapse is. Okay? Now, in your book, they're going to talk about neurotransmitters, which are these chemicals that are released from one neuron and stimulate another neuron. Okay? Now, it turns out that there are, I think, over 60 neurotransmitters, chemicals that work in your brain. Okay, so there are tons and tons of chemicals that are working in your brain right now. And neurotransmitters are molecules that are released from neurons that communicate with other neurons. Although there are tons of neurotransmitters, about 7 of them do 95% of the work. And you can take a look at them over here. You've got acetylcholine, which, like I said, is responsible for memory, learning, and is related to sleeping and arousal. Basically, it's sort of an arousal neurochemical, if you will. Then you have norepinephrine. Have you folks ever heard of adrenaline, noradrenaline? Epinephrine and norepinephrine are chemicals that are secreted by your brain that cause you to get excited. They are arousal and alertness neurotransmitters. I'll bet a lot of you have probably heard of serotonin, because serotonin is implicated in depression. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter in your brain that is responsible for mood regulation. If you are depressed, what you take is a drug that magnifies the effect of serotonin in your brain and causes your mood to be elevated so you're not depressed. You have a reward neurotransmitter in your brain called dopamine. And this chemical is responsible in the reward pathway in your brain. So when you eat food and it tastes good, when you have sex, when you get an A on a test, when you win a court case, when you get that job, and anytime you are happy and rewarded, dopamine is released in your brain and it makes you happy and excited. Now, dopamine is also responsible for, like I said, dopamine is excited. These neurotransmitters can be excitatory or inhibitory. Dopamine actually works in your cerebellum, sort of to inhibit voluntary movement and make your motor movements smooth, so that you walk smoothly and you move your body smoothly. I don't know if any of you have ever seen somebody with Parkinson's disease, and you'll notice that they shake a lot. Their brain, the cells in their brain that create dopamine die off, and so they don't have enough dopamine in their brain, and so their body parts start shaking. So dopamine, important for reward and motivation, and it also helps smooth out your motor movements so that you can move and dance really smoothly and cool. Okay? GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. Don't say that. I just wanted to show off by pronouncing it. We're going to call it GABA. GABA is related to anxiety and nerves. If you are a person with an anxiety disorder, your brain is probably not producing enough GABA. So you take a drug that magnifies the effect of GABA in your brain and it calms you down. So GABA is primarily an inhibitory neurotransmitter and it causes brain areas sort of to calm down, if you will. All right. Now, anytime you learn or remember something, so if you've got the acetylcholine, you're paying attention to me. But the second step of that is learning, right? And glutamate is specifically useful in learning and, more importantly, memory. When you memorize things, the glutamate in your brain is activating your memory neurons that store these memories. Okay? And then there's the final neuron we call endorphin. I think it was the first neurotransmitter identified, I think way back in the 50s. And the endorphin is responsible. It's also important in the reward circuit in your brain, and it's also responsible for pain reduction. I don't know if any of you have ever been jogging and experienced the runner's high. If you start running, you're going to find that when you first start jogging, it's really, really painful. But if you run maybe 1.5 miles, you're going to get to your place where you actually start to feel really good while you're running. And we call this the runner's high. Basically, these endorphins are being released in your brain and start to make you feel good. And that pain that you initially suffered running goes away. You interpret it as feeling good, and we call it the runner's high. Now, I want to remind you again, a neurotransmitter's effect, excitatory or inhibitory, may change depending upon where in the nervous system it is released. Logan Phillips has experienced the runner's high. It is surreal. It is weird when you kind of feel that, and it sort of feels good, right, Logan? Great point. Thank you for bringing that out. Folks, if any of you have experience with this or want to interject just like Logan, feel free to shout out. That's great. Remember, the neurotransmitter's effect, excitatory or inhibitory, changes depending upon where in the nervous system it is secreted. So, for example, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, this stuff, norepinephrine, if it's secreted in your peripheral nervous system around your heart, boom, 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 it makes your heart beat faster. On the other hand, when it's secreted in your frontal lobe, it actually causes you to slow down and be able to focus. I don't know if you folks have ever heard of the drug Ritalin. It is given to people who have attention problems. What it does is it sort of calms down the area in your brain that causes you to shift your attention, which allows you to focus. On the other hand, I know that some kids take it because it acts like speed. It speeds some kids up. Ritalin works on this norepinephrine circuit, and it causes some people to get high when it's released in the peripheral nervous system. But for people who have trouble focusing, it actually calms part of their brain down so that they can focus and pay attention. Cool. Thank you very much, Gustavo. I appreciate the comment. Now, I asked you in the text I sent this morning. Have any of you ever? Actually, I forget what I mentioned. I forget, but I'm going to ask you the question now. When you drink a lot of alcohol, I don't know if you've noticed, it sort of impairs your ability to walk. It impairs your balance. It certainly impairs your driving. Do you know why? Because alcohol is a psychoactive drug that impairs the chemical functioning occurring in the cerebellum part of your brain. Your cerebellum is responsible for your balance and your smooth motor movements needed for driving a car and walking. When you drink alcohol, the alcohol molecule goes into your cerebellum and it messes with the functioning of the neurotransmitters in your cerebellum. Okay? Now, so what is a psychoactive or neuromodulating drugs? Now, you actually have a fatty barrier that keeps chemicals from getting into your brain because the chemical functioning in your brain is so important. You have this thing called a blood-brain barrier. It's this fatty filter, if you will, that keeps molecules from getting into your brain and messing with your functioning. However, Psychoactive drugs are chemicals that are small enough to pass through this blood-brain barrier, and they get in there and they mess with your neurotransmitter functioning right in this synapse. They have two basic effects. Some of them magnify the effect of a neurotransmitter, and some of them work to impair the functioning of a neurotransmitter. So we have what we call agonists and antagonists. So if you've ever taken an SSRI, have any of you ever heard of an SSRI? Like Zoloft, right? We take Zoloft to improve our mood. What SSRIs like Zoloft do is this chemical goes in and it magnifies the effect that serotonin is having in your synapse. And so it makes your serotonin receptor sites work faster, and it elevates your mood. On the other hand, some drugs that you take actually impair the functioning in your neurotransmitters. Now, one of the things that we know about people with schizophrenia is they have an overabundance or their thorazine, their dopamine systems appear to be working overtime. So drugs like thorazine actually work against the effect of dopamine in your brain system. And by decreasing the effect of dopamine in your system, it causes people with hallucinations and delusions. It causes the hallucinations and delusions to get better or go away. Now, tons of different psychoactive chemicals, and they vary widely from marijuana, LSD, to caffeine, and nicotine is actually a psychoactive drug. And you have lots of nicotinic receptors in your brain. Okay? Now, neurotransmitters are released by synapses. And by the way, I do want you, if you're more interested in understanding how these neurotransmitters work, I highly suggest you go to the course resources folder. I have a cool little interactive demo called the Mouse Party that shows you how different drugs, heroin, marijuana, LSD, ecstasy, alcohol, how all of these drugs work. It's a general description of how they work in the synapse to impair your functioning. I highly suggest you go to the Mouse Party and spend about 10 or 15 minutes in this interactive demonstration learning about how these neuromodulating drugs work. Okay, finally, briefly, running out of time. Now, neurotransmitters are released out of dendrites, and they don't travel very far, and they work very, very locally, and they work very, very quickly. But you know what? It turns out that we have a different set of chemical system that also affects the functioning of your neurons. This is called your endocrine system. And you look below me and you'll see the endocrine glands in a male and a female. You have a pineal gland, a pituitary gland, a thyroid, you've got adrenal glands, and you've got ovaries and testes, which are releasing testosterones and estrogens, adrenaline, is a hormone. And here's the deal. These hormones, they're not released at a synapse. They're actually released in your bloodstream. And they work systemically. Instead of working just in one part of your body, they flow through your body and cause a general effect in the overall functioning of your body. What are some examples of these hormones? Testosterone and estrogen, which influences your sexual development and your sexual behavior. And then when we get to the stress chapter, we're going to talk about how cortisol is released in your body and affects your overall level of arousal in your brain. So cortisol and testosterone are hormones that are released in your body. They work just like neurotransmitters. They work to activate neurons, but they float all over your body, activating lots of neurons instead of just one or two. And I'm not trying to be vague here, but we're going to talk about testosterone and estrogen in chapter 9, and we're going to talk about cortisol in chapter 11. So we'll come back to them. I just want you to know that those are examples of hormones. Okay, it is 9:51. That's all I had to tell you for today. Does anybody have any questions before I say goodbye? Anybody got plans for today? Anybody having any problems in this class or another class? I hope you're doing well. I hope you're enjoying the class so far. This weekend webinar on Wednesday night, I'm going to have some cool videos of people with brain-related disorders that I'm going to show you. Actually some remarkable things. So I do hope you come to the Wednesday night webinar if you can. Any questions? I'm looking in the chat bar and I do not see any comments. So I feel like you're either bored or in complete understanding of what I've talked about. Louis Tapia is all good in capitals. Cool. All right, folks. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. Take care. Have a great day. And I do hope to see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Take care.